This is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about the formation of the Climax Record, which is a big boondoggle in the history of sound recording because there's so little information about it. And I have talked about this before, but I wanted to go into more depth and show some good examples and also throw in some theories that I may have here pertaining to the Climax Record. Now, in order to give you an understanding of the Climax Record, I've got to go back in the history of the disc record. And of course, the beginnings of the disc record is, of course, the Berliner gramophone disc. Okay, this is a very nice early Berliner gramophone disc. And of course, the Berliner gramophone disc was developed by Emil Berliner. And from about 1894 onward, he was making recordings in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, etc., and eventually would travel the world with the Berliner gramophone, and of course eventually lead to the company called the Gramophone and Typewriter Company in Europe. Now, Emil Berliner had an advertising agent by the name of Frank Seaman. And he made a deal with Frank Seaman starting in 1896 for 15 years. It's a long time. And that deal was that Frank Seaman would buy the various machines and records from Berliner at a set price and then resell them. He was the marketing agent. And this was supposed to go on until 1911, actually. That's quite a long contract. And so Frank Seaman went to work, and he was phenomenal at what he did. And before long, the Berliner gramophone disc and record were selling magnificently. And Seaman went to Berliner and said, "Hey, I have totally transformed your company. I have totally made this a very successful industry, and I deserve a better cut." Berliner more or less said a deal's a deal. And this started Seaman saying, "Okay, you want to play that game? I can play it too." And he went to work behind the scenes, setting up his own company, which we'll get back to in just a moment. At this same time, you had the Edison cylinder machine and record, which is doing fine. But you have the Columbia Phonograph Company, which had, just a few years earlier, broken off from the North American group and formed their own organization under Edward Easton called the Columbia Phonograph Company, and they merged with the Bell-Tainter Graphophone, and so it became the American Graphophone Company, the Columbia Graph. They used a lot of different names, but let's just call it the Columbia Phonograph Company for now. And they wanted to get into the disc business. And they had no patents on it, no nothing. And Frank Seaman obviously had issues with Berliner. And Frank Seaman was constantly being attacked by the Columbia Phonograph Company. And their star lawyer, who was phenomenal, by the name of Phillip Morro. Now, Phillip Morro was attacking the Berliner disc constantly, saying it's illegal. And eventually he came up with this phenomenal plan, which was he looked at a Berliner gramophone disc and he took out a Berliner gramophone, put the needle, and the groove moved the needle. And that fit right into a patent with the Bell-Tainter system called a needle moved by a groove, which was something totally different. It was a groove system of the cylinder machine to allow the floating stylus to go across the cylinder without having the grooves moving the needle itself. And so he attacked Seaman with that. Seaman fought back. At the same time, he's fighting a two-front war. He's also fighting with Berliner. And finally, Seaman He's had it up to here. And he basically stops fighting with Berliner and goes off in his own way and starts doing something very interesting and nefarious. And that is, he's creating his own records using Berliner discs, just wiping out any information, no information on the back, except for what we call the zonophone notch. And he forms this new company called Zonophone. The Universal Talking Machine Company, as it would be eventually called. And so he starts pirating a lot of Berliner records. Also, he starts pirating some of the European Berliner recordings as well, the operatic recordings. Well, once again, Seaman's attacked by Columbia. Finally, Seaman and Columbia talk. And the end result is this, that Columbia tells Seaman, you help us, we'll help you. One hand washes the other. And eventually, Seaman says, yes, it is true. The Berliner gramophone disc does interfere with the bell-tainter patent, a needle moved by a groove. It's taken to court. An injunction is pushed against Berliner. Berliner is put out of business, for the time being at least, in the United States. Seaman is not bothered at all by Columbia. And in fact, Columbia, for a short while, starts to market the Universal Talking Machine records, the Zonophone records, for Seaman. But they're still not happy, okay? They want to be in their industry, but they have no patents whatsoever. Now, the person that does have the patents, or at least the sympathy of Emil Berliner, is Eldridge Johnson. Now, Eldridge Johnson was the mechanic, eventually the factory manager for Berliner, manufacturing the machines that were sent overseas, working on improving the records. He had developed a wax recording system, which was phenomenal compared to some of the early Berliners. And he is forced into going into business himself because Berliner is no longer in business, and Johnson has this massive factory and no one to buy his materials. So he goes and starts selling himself. Now he produces a record. Now this is his record. It's the Consolidated Talking Machine. And the Consolidated Talking Machine is very important because it's the first record with a label, by the way. And it's a wax recording system. It's the first disc of its type. And they make big announcements in the papers because they have nothing to lose. They have like $10,000 and they put half of it in advertising. As soon as he goes to work and putting out his records, the Columbia/Seaman forces attack Johnson and try to destroy him. And they fail. And Johnson wins. And of course, by the beginning of 1901, not only is he making the 7 inches, but he's making the 10-inch recordings. Okay? And these are, of course, manufactured by Eldridge Johnson. They're Victor records. He was the victor in the court case. Why not? At this point, Columbia and Seaman kind of split their ways. And Columbia starts working out a deal with the BURT Company of Millburn, New Jersey. Now, the BURT Company, B-U-R-T, I made a mistake before calling it B-E-R-T, and the BURT Company was pressing records for other groups. He was doing some stuff for Johnson and had fiddled with some stuff, I believe, with Berliner. And so the BURT Company, starting in mid-1901, works out a deal with Columbia. Now, here's the thing. There are no patents. This is purely illegal. There's nothing to protect this record. So it's all done initially on the QT, and these first records are just blank. And they have embossed information, which is kind of hard to read, especially when I'm trying to do it here. But the embossed information just says, and I'll read it to you, like this one here. A Climax Record, Globe Record Company, New York, Cornet. and you know, the number of the record, etc. Now, the thing is, there's not a mention of Columbia here. But within a short period of time, the Globe Record Company, which isn't exactly BURT, and this is important, because what happened, Columbia and BURT made a deal, and BURT creates a sub-company called the Globe Record Company within its own facility, and they manufacture Climax records for Columbia. Now, as I said, initially it has no label, but then things change. Pardon me while I dig. I need to have a whole bevy of assistants here to help me. Be easier. But this is very important. It's 1901, and they start to make those recordings. Now, one thing that's very interesting, I didn't realize initially that they made not only 7-inch but 10-inch embossed. And this is an example. This is a very unusual example of an embossed 10-inch record, which you don't see. There are not many of them made, as far as I can tell. And they go to work, and of course it has the label now, and it's a Climax record, and manufactured solely for the Columbia Phonograph Company by the Globe Record Company. It's kind of a way to cover tracks, I guess. So, at this point, they start putting out their records. And they put out a machine at the same time, a disc machine. At the same time, Seaman is marketing his records, and, you know, this is an early Universal. I don't think it's... I see there's so much stuff that was up here that they kind of pushed out of the way. Let me see if I can find a better example here. Hold on, I think I have one here. Here, this is a better one. Here. Actually, it doesn't mention Zonophone at all. It just calls it the Universal Talking Machine. There you are. These are Universal Talking Machine records. And of course, once again, there's nothing on the back. It's interesting stuff. This is very early on. This is 1899, 1900. And by the time we get to 1901, things have changed again with Zonophone. But all of this is going on at the same time. Now, I will continue, yeah. The Climax record is manufactured somewhat. It was an open secret, okay? But at this point, Eldridge Johnson is fighting for his very existence with the Consolidated Talking Machine Company. In October 3rd, 1901, Berliner and Johnson merged their interests and create the Victor Talking Machine Company Incorporated. So, now there is a company, and it has the full protection of the Berliner patents. While Johnson had been working for Berliner, and when Johnson was working himself, he had assistants. One of them was Joseph Jones. Joseph Jones watched Johnson, what he was doing. He saw what Johnson was doing. Low-flying plane. And the thing is that he saw that Johnson wasn't applying for a patent. Therefore, he applied for a patent. It was refused. He applied again. It was refused. Now comes into the scene Phillip Morro from Columbia saying, give me the patent, I'll make it work. And he rewrites it, presents it, and it is approved on December the 10th, 1901. This is very important because all of a sudden, Columbia has the patent to make wax-recorded discs. It's called the Jones patent. Jones is paid $25,000. He's a happy soul, and so is Columbia. And at that point, they all say, now we can take a break, and they walk away. At this very point, the Globe Record Company is unhappy with Columbia. They've been so busy with everything else, they haven't been paying attention to paying all their bills. And they're late on their bills to be paid to Globe. Johnson is aware of this. Johnson goes to Globe, says, I'll solve the situation. I will buy the company. And so he buys it from the BURT Company for $10,000. Takes all of the stampers for Columbia and marks them. And here we are. Take a look at this. Here's their mark. You can see it right there. He puts VTM on every Climax record. Edward Easton comes back from their little vacation and they discover that the person who's their biggest competitor is now pressing their records. All hell breaks loose. And Edward Easton immediately starts negotiating with Johnson. And they work out a deal because you got to remember, Columbia does have a little bit of a fighting advantage at the moment. They have the Jones patent. And so Johnson can say to Columbia, you can't make disc records because we have the patent for the disc records. But now Columbia can go to Victor and say, you can't make wax recorded recordings because we have the patent on that. So they realize they have to pool their patents, the only way to solve the situation. So in February 1902, they basically set up their situation. Columbia buys back the Globe Record Company. And now they own it. Now they can press their own records because they own the company that does it. And Johnson can make his records because there's no more problems with the Jones patent. Now, at this point, Columbia has no reason not to start making their own record. And they do. And let me show you something. Now, this is a very interesting thing. This is a Columbia disc. Now, I want you to look. At the bottom of the label, there's no information. No information at all. No patent information. No nothing. It's for all intents and purposes. For all intents and purposes, it is a Climax record. But it has a Columbia label. Now, I'm of the belief that starting after February of 1902, they started making these Columbia discs because there was nothing to stop. There was no reason to not make them. But they were making the Climax right alongside of it because Climax had no problem right now, and Climax was known as a label. And Columbia hadn't really started, and they had to re-record a lot of stuff. And eventually, they would have a different label. Let's see, this one no, this one doesn't have it either. Now, this is another example. If you look here, you will see no information at all. Of course, this one has the VTM on it as well. Now, I go a little further here in the pile. You'll pardon the expression, yeah? Here we have another Columbia. Now, this one's a little later. But if you look at the very bottom of the label, you will see patent information. Right there. And that patent information, of course, has an 1886 patent and the Jones wax patent. And so, the Columbia label starts being put together. in the beginnings of 1902. And by the summer, I think it's summer of 1902, the Climax record is discontinued and the Columbia disc record comes out. But during that period of, let's go late February, maybe March of 1902 until that summer, there's a transfer of recordings, of various information, and lots of records are put out with all kinds of mistakes. And I really think that this is the period of time that all the mistakes are being made. And at the same time, all this stuff is going on at the Globe Record Company. BURT Records are making Victor records. And I don't think it's visible here, but let me just see, where would it be? Yes. Underneath Nipper, if you look carefully, you'll see a B. Okay, that's the B for BURT. And if I compare this, it's an interesting thing to show you, the thickness is quite similar with the Columbia. But if I put this against a standard Victor pressing, which I will get to in just a second, you'll see a marked difference in the thickness. So this is the beginnings of this. I think this would make a fantastic, amazing miniseries, because there was so much more going on and so much I haven't even talked about pertaining to Victor, Columbia, Zonophone. Zonophone would eventually, put out its label with a shield and try to look legitimate, but it had problems throughout its career. And by 1903, the Zonophone went out of business and was purchased by the Gramophone and Typewriter. And the popular part, the Gramophone Typewriter took the classical. The popular part was purchased by Eldridge Johnson and manufactured in Newark, New Jersey, under the control of Bedford Royal, who was Johnson's man to make sure everything worked. Eventually, Victor would absorb Zonophone later in that first decade, maybe around 1910. Eventually, Columbia would take the Globe Record Company and BURT and move them up to Hartford, Connecticut. And of course, Victor would cease all work with BURT because Columbia was advertising that they were manufacturing their records, and would set up perhaps the greatest recording and pressing company in the world. So this is a little bit of the history. I hope you find this interesting. I've tried to cram in as much as I could in 24 minutes here about the history of the beginnings of the Climax record. And there's all this other stuff as well. So if you've got comments and thoughts and ideas, add them here. I'd love to start a dialogue with lots of collectors and think, what do you think? What's your ideas about a lot of this? What things do you think are different? So we'll go from there, and thank you very much.